early age, we are taught that failure is bad. Failure is to be avoided at all costs. Don't fail that test. Don't get cut from the team. Do everything you can just to get by. What this causes is a trade-off and creates a culture focused not on succeeding, but on not failing. And the question is that right? Do we go into our careers and start our jobs just so that we don't lose our jobs, or so that we can develop our knowledge, our skills, our passions, our network for what we do? When we educate and care for and protect our children, is it so that they're not held back, or so that they can be nourished and so that they can flourish? Is being Jewish just about continuity and survival, or is it about passion, about purpose, about thriving? So the question is, how do we change the focus? How do we shift it from worrying about not failing to succeeding? This is what I wake up to just about every day of the week. It's Keith. Keith, when I have a chance to work out with him, pushes me very, very hard. And so the other day, I was doing push-ups, get to 60, 70, 80 push-ups. And I take a look at him and I say, Keith, why don't you just tell me how many push-ups you want me to do? And he yelled at me, that's not the point. And I said, what is the point? He says, the point is you have to push to failure. You have to push through the failure so that you can learn where your limits are and learn what your strengths are. Pushing ourselves through our limits and to our strengths. And so tonight, I want to ask, what if? What would we do if we weren't afraid to fail? I believe that we would push. Pushing to failure is a Jewish concept. We read in Proverbs, Sheva yipol tzadik v'kam. A righteous person falls 7 times only to get up. Just last week, we commemorated the destruction of our temples. But Tisha B'Av isn't just a day of failure. In fact, the Midrash tells us, B'Tish'a B'Av charav habayit. True, on the 9th day of Av, our temple, our holy home was destroyed. But also, B'Tish'a B'Av nolad HaMashiach. On the 9th day of Av was born the Messiah. These are not 2 separate events that just happen to coincide on the same day. The kernel of the one, the birth of redemption, the process and the path to success is born within the destruction itself. From failing, from failure, from falling down, we can find success. As the prophet Micha tells us, Ki nafalti kamti, because although when I fall down, I will rise. I get back up again. Failure then is a step, maybe the first step, that inherently leads to redemption and success. The question for us this evening is, how do we get there? And I'd like to suggest 3 steps for us to push and try to get to failure. The first step is to develop a culture where it's okay to push to fail. When my kids were growing up, my 3 wonderful, amazing kids, and they first started to learn how to walk, they were a little shaky, and they would fall down, they'd bump into things, and they'd fall on the ground, and there'd be that pause. And a friend of mine showed me an amazing trick. He said, instead of saying, oh, I'm so sorry, you're hurt, he taught me to look at them and pretend that they had just slid safely into second base. And I would say, safe, and give them a big smile. And you know what they did? They would look back at me and smile back at me and think, hey, it was okay. I fell down, but it's no big deal. It doesn't really hurt that bad. I'm all right. And I believe that this notion that falling down does not necessarily lead to negative consequences informs their lives till today. Similarly, Dan Senor and Saul Singer, in their famous book, Startup Nation, talk about the Israeli culture, and that the culture is a really perfect way for startups to take place, to get going, to get launched. And why is that? One of the reasons they explain is that there it is okay to try and fail. True, they say, success is best, but failure is not a stigma. And in fact, it can be even a resume builder. So if you fall off the bike, it's okay. It's not going to hurt. You're fine. Smile. Get back up. This is the first step, creating a culture where it's okay to try and push to fail. Step 2. Second step is to incentivize risk-taking and creative thinking. When God first calls out to Abraham, he tells him, Lech lecha me'artzecha. Leave everything you know, your land, your parents' home, everything you know. But he doesn't stop there. He says, yes, I'm going to ask you to take a major leap. I'm going to ask you to do something that is a big risk. But there's a second part. He says, Va'avarechecha. I will bless you. God provides the incentive to Abraham, to take that risk, to take the plunge, to take the leap of faith. Now, not all of us have the blessing of being able to get a direct command from God on a regular basis, but we do have spouses and families and colleagues and friends. And just a couple weeks ago, I was at an office retreat, and they gave me some well-deserved but harsh feedback. They said, you don't stop enough to think. You're not doing enough creative thinking. You're not doing enough pushing. You're not doing enough thinking dangerously and taking risks with your thinking. And they were right. And so now, every day I try to set aside a few minutes, write on my whiteboard, on a piece of paper, do some thinking, some reading that gets me outside the box, that pushes me. It's this type of incentive, this type of process that is the second step to incentivize risk-taking and creative thinking. The third step, review your mistakes, learn from them, and get back in the game. Maimonides, in his laws about repentance, says that there are 3 parts to doing complete repentance. The first is to recognize that you had actually failed, that you did something wrong. It takes hard for some people to realize that they made a mistake, that they sinned, that they failed. And so the first step is hakarat hachet, recognizing that you missed, that you messed up, that you failed. The second step is to learn the right things from that. And the way you do that is through vidui, by expressing, this is what I did. These are the bad things that I did. That's the second part. And the third is to find yourself, or maybe even place yourself, in the same situation again. And this time, do the right thing. This is, for me, somewhat reminiscent of one of my favorite quotes from one of the great champions in sports history, Michael Jordan, who said that though he had all this success, the key line is that I failed over and over in my life, and that is why I succeed. Michael Jordan failed. That's how he looked at it, and that is why he kept going. So these are the 3 steps we need in order to push to fail. Number 1, develop a culture where it's okay to do so. Number 2, incentivize risk-taking and creative thinking. And third, review your mistakes, learn from them, and get back in the game. 10 years ago, I lost $1 million in a day. Many of you would have fired me on the spot. Probably would have had good cause to do so. But my bosses didn't do that. They told me to learn from the experience and to change my risk profile. Not to have no risk profile, but to shift it, to be a little more careful, to figure out a different hedge for our hedge fund. That lesson, that support, that guidance helped me a few years later when I left the for-profit world and I went to be the executive director of a small organization. On the first day that I was there, a number of board members called me up, came over to me, and said that they felt that there were a lot of organizations out there, and that their goal for me while I was doing creative programming was to merge this organization into a larger one. Talk about being pushed to fail. This was my goal. And so, over the next couple of years, as we developed new programs, creative thinking, doing all kinds of things, we also had conversations with larger organizations, and in fact, within 2 years, had merged with Yeshiva University. This challenge that was given to me by this board is the same challenge I want to leave us all with this evening. What would we do if we weren't afraid to fail? What would we do ourselves, our families, our children, our students, our organizations, our shuls, our schools, our communities, if we weren't afraid to fail? Would our children grow up to lead passionate lives where they put their passions into their jobs? Would our schools focus on teaching in a classroom that is 21st century education, technology, focused on learning? Would our organizations put aside their differences and maximize efficiencies by maximizing philanthropic dollars? And finally, would our communities focus not just on surviving, but on finding that passion and thriving? And so I leave you all this evening with that question. What would you do? What would you do? What would you do if you weren't afraid to fail? Thank you.